Not all Channel Islanders took the German occupation passively.
Youngsters like my age, we used to go around siphoning the petrol out of tanks, letting the tyres down.
And I went out one night after the curfew with a little bit of tar and an old brush or stick or something, and painted a couple of swastikas on the doors of people that I knew, women that I knew were going around with the Germans.
There was dozens of little groups in the island. They'd steal arms, break into German billets and that, pinch belts, different bits of odds and ends, you know. Little bits of resistance, but enough to make the Germans keep looking around and have their spies around.
The prison was full up. People were queuing up to go into prison. If you were caught out after curfew, say, then they'd say, right, 3 months' time, you have to go into prison for a week or so for being out after curfew. So there was hundreds of people queuing up to go into prison.
When your sentence had been passed and they marched you back from the court-martial and you were put into the civilian side, they couldn't treat you exactly like criminals, but the ones who stopped you from escaping, who guarded you, was British warders with the crown on their hat. In other words, your own people guarded you, not the Germans.
I was interrogated by the civil police, and they found a British leaflet in my pocket, which had been dropped by the Royal Air Force. I was remanded in jail, and the next thing I knew, I had a visit from a military policeman, and he had the leaflet in his hand. So consequently, I knew that I'd been betrayed by the civil police. I was considered an undesirable, but I wasn't the only one. There were several others that were also deported as undesirables, including a few Jews, Irish people, and conscientious objectors from the mainland of England, who were there for the potato harvest just prior to the occupation. They were also deported, and as far as I know, very few came back, if any.
One dear lady, Mrs. Gould, looked after an escaped Russian prisoner of war, and she was caught and she was sent to a German concentration camp where she died.
A lot of jealousy went on. They'd report people, you know. They didn't realise the seriousness of it. Report people for having the radio, so the chap would get arrested, be given 3 months, he'd be sent to France, but they didn't always come back. They'd be forgotten and sent to a camp in Germany, and that was the end of the music.
I can give you one instance of a case where the rector of St. Saviour's Parish in Jersey had a radio in his rectory, which was discovered by the Germans from a giveaway source. The Germans arrested 18 people, including the gravedigger, the church wardens, and several other people connected with the church. From this one little radio, everyone was sent, including, I must say, some people, including women of over 70 years of age. They were sentenced from 2 months to 4 years in prison. Those who were sentenced to a long-term imprisonment had to go to France. And of those 18 people, 4 of them have never been seen again to this very day.
There were people who were informing to the Gestapo by letter, usually anonymous letter, and some of the post office employees would intercept these letters.
When the Gestapo chap was in my office, and he seemed fairly reasonable in his way, and I said, I can't understand a chap like you doing the job you have to do. I saw you outside of Boots the chemist in civilian clothes, mixing with the little crowd there. I said, what, were you listening for something? He said, Mr. LeMaitre, I haven't got to go out and listen for something. All I have to do is to open my mail in the mornings, and that gives me a lot of information.
Fortifying the islands as an essential buttress of the so-called Atlantic Wall became a top priority for Hitler during 1943 and 1944, as the war turned against him and an Allied invasion of Europe became just a matter of time. He took a detailed interest in the building of the bunkers and the watchtowers that now began to proliferate on the islands. Alderney in particular was turned into a fortress devoid of inhabitants, except for Daphne Pope, who had chosen to brave it out with her young family.
They sent in their dynamite boys, as we used to call them, and they blew holes in it. And that was the beginning of the underground tunnels. They had real slave workers from the Ukraine, poor devils. And they had fortifications on top of the island and underneath the island. And indeed, I was told that it was the most fortified bit of the whole of northwest France. I remember a little rhyme for the children, something about, oh, I do think it's foolish the time they have spent in fixing barbed wire and demixing cement, and sometimes I fancy they won't be content till Alderney's covered with wire and cement.
But Alderney did have other inhabitants, temporary ones, forced visitors, who apart from occasionally scratching their names in the concrete, left little individual evidence of their luckless sojourn on the island, while building these massive monuments to one man's paranoia.
A lot of young chaps my age were called up to work for the Germans, because when I saw what I had to do, I didn't seem to like the job. So I had a bit of an argument with a German soldier. Then I walked off the job. Then, evening later, I was arrested and sent to Alderney.
Of the 3 forced labour camps, one was for specialist workers and was a pretty normal sort of place for construction workers in wartime, carpenters, glaziers, and so on. And nothing much happened there. In the other 2 forced labour camps, each of which at peak housed about 1,500, there was a great deal of brutality. The Poles and Ukrainians and Russians who had been shipped out in the summer of the previous year were wearing the summer clothes that they'd been fished off the street in through 2 winters in Alderney. As their shoes ran out, they wound bits of rag around their feet to try and stop them freezing. They were fed 1 meal a day of cabbage soup with bread. Very occasionally they had a slice of sausage. Very occasionally they had perhaps some butter or some sugar. And they drank acorn coffee. They were radically undernourished.
They used to give the number of persons they want to take from a village. And the head of the village had to supply this number. And I was one of those numbers.
In the 4th camp, the SS concentration camp, it was worse still. There was beating, and people died of exposure and maltreatment.
Viel Prügel. Schläge wurden jeden Tag ausgeteilt. Unter anderem war einige SS-Leute sehr brutal. Da war ein Russe, der glaubte, im Abfallhaufen holte der sich Kartoffelschalen raus und wurde von der SS dabei gesehen. Und da wurde er mit dem Gewehrkolben, haben sie ihm den ganzen Schädel kaputt geschlagen. Und das hieß dann nachher Unfall, Schädelbruch durch Unfall. Dann wurden an der Baustelle Leute, die nicht mehr arbeiten konnten, die fielen ja glatt bei dem Arbeiten, wurden besonders an der Baustelle, wie nennt sich das, Artillerieleitstand da oben. Da wurden Häftlinge in den flüssigen Beton gestoßen und wurden einbetoniert.
They used to put lumps of sugar in the rows of carrots. And as you were working and you saw this lump of sugar, you'd work twice as hard to get to it. And then the guard would move it another 100 yards up further. Then you'd work to get to it and he'd move it again. And probably at the end of the day, you might be lucky to get 1 lump of sugar.
Documents show that there about 400 people died there. I think it's probably double the figure.
They used to have 1 coffin for everybody, and they used to get some of the prisoners to go down at Longy Common, dig the grave, and they used to put the body in the coffin and take it down, and had a false bottom.
This is rare film of forced labourers on Alderney, taken by one of their overseers. At the peak, the Germans brought in 16,000 or so foreign workers to the islands. Russian prisoners, Spanish communists, German dissidents, French Jews, Poles, Czechs, Yugoslavs, Ukrainians, Belgians, Dutch, and even a few Algerians. But only Alderney felt the presence of the SS.
In our camp, we had a road that went to a fort and had a tunnel. And this tunnel, there was a machine gun post at one end, and the tunnel was sealed the other end, but the sea used to come up to it. And we had orders that if there had been any landings by the British or the Americans, we had to get from our hut into that tunnel within 2 minutes. And this tunnel's been named the Tunnel of Death. No doubt they would have machine gunned us and opened the back and let the tide wash us out, because they didn't want any prisoners to be alive when there'd been any landings.
The islanders were eagerly awaiting the landings on the French mainland, and on June the 6th, 1944, they finally happened.
This particular night was a terrific amount of planes going over, and the Germans were firing at them and goodness knows what. And, then this next morning, early in the morning, we were listening to the radios to find out what had happened, and we heard that they'd landed at D-Day. So, of course, everybody was going around cheering like mad because it wasn't going to be long now.
But it was going to be another 11 months. The underground hospital on Jersey, built at enormous cost in human life, at least 9 Russian workers remain entombed here, epitomized the siege fears of the German garrison as the Allies bypassed the islands. Even at the end, the Germans were still extending the tunnels. But now that no food could reach them, cut off from their homeland, they suffered as much as the inhabitants.
We got a few slices of bread, and then the lunch was mostly a very thin soup with some potatoes. Then we had to slaughter our own horses.
We had cats, dogs, rabbits. The rabbit population was quite numerous when we got here, but by the time we left 9 months later, they were non-existent. We had them all.
They were as hungry as we were towards the end of the occupation. One of my most gratifying sights was to see a foraging party of German soldiers going limpetting on the rocks around the shore. I never thought they'd drop to that.
I even shot 2 seagulls and ate them. And for a German sailor to do that, because there's a superstition in the German Navy that in the seagull there's the soul of a drowned sailor, you see. That's how desperate we got.
The last 6 months of the occupation was the worst, because everything had virtually gone. And had it not been for the Vigo, the Red Cross parcels, it would have been a different story.
The parcels began arriving at the end of 1944, following protracted negotiations. Churchill had been reluctant to let them be sent, fearing that the occupiers would collar the lot, since some of the Germans, including their new commander, Admiral Hofmeyer, were on record as wanting to hold the islands to the bitter end. Churchill had said, "Let them starve," meaning, of course, the garrison, though some islanders wondered whether he meant them too. But when reports reached London of how desperate conditions were, he relented. In any case, the end was nigh.
Captain Lieutenant Arnim Zimmermann, 23 years old and arrogantly proud of being a Nazi, visits the British destroyer Bulldog. He came to ask our terms for an armistice and went back with a flea in his ear to tell his chief, Admiral Hofmeyer, that it was unconditional surrender or else. On the quarterdeck of the Bulldog, 6 hours later, General Heine signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces in the islands on behalf of his chief. When he signed, Brigadier Snow said to him, "You will cause all German flags in the Channel Islands to be hauled down." "Jawohl," said General Heine.
The date was May the 9th, 1945, one forever etched in the memory of all islanders.
Can we imagine the feelings of the Channel Islanders when they saw the Navy was there? At last, the freeing of the Channel Islands, the only British territory to be occupied by the Huns, was an accomplished fact.
It was a fantastic and memorable occasion, one that only comes once in a lifetime. Very emotional. When the British troops landed, the island population just went mad. We rushed down the pier. Everyone was laughing, crying, joking, embracing, kissing, hugging, I can't tell you. It was a terribly emotional time to see British uniforms and to joke and chat and know that it was all over.
Even after all these years, I can't talk about that without emotion. It's a thing that you can't talk about. You could only live through that experience to know what it meant.
No more curfew that night. Music, not the German band music or the German song, but music from radios which appeared suddenly from everywhere. There would be food and laughter, but the one thing is that's indescribable unless you were there, was that everybody was so happy.
All around the harbour, there were people shouting and cheering, children and flags. And as we got off the landing craft and walked up to our headquarters through the town, there were the soldiers doling out chocolates and things to the children. Of course, that chocolate was usually laced with cod liver oil, and it made the children as sick as dogs. But it was very moving, really, very moving.
There's Vice Admiral Hofmeyer being removed. He looks pretty browned off, but being a Hun, he apparently still thinks he's got the right of way. It was highly satisfactory to watch these German troops laying down the arms which they'd used all these years in a futile attempt to subjugate the spirit of the people. Better still was the royal proclamation restoring liberty to the Channel Islands, which was read by Brigadier Snow. And then once again, the rightful flag was flying everywhere throughout the island. As for celebrating, well, this was their V-Day. By Allied victory in Europe, the people of the islands had been freed not from bombs and rockets, but from what must be even worse, the revolting presence and persecution of the German bully. No wonder they rejoiced.
When Liberation Day came and all the radios came out onto the windowsills and all this music and jollifications, and I had a very mixed feeling inside, because I knew that something valuable in a way was going, this useful happy camaraderie that you share all your troubles and share your little bits of goodies and things, and everybody suddenly started becoming very selfish again. And that's the way it's remained, so far as I can see.
The task of shifting their former occupiers to prisoner of war camps in England passed off relatively quietly.
Einige bedanken sich auch bei mir persönlich, aber sie sagten auch sofort, ihr müsst verstehen, dass wir froh sind, dass wir die Tommys wieder hier haben. Admiral Hofmeyer, der letzte Befehlshaber der Inseln, wurde von Dutzenden von Leuten angesprochen, die ihm die Hand schüttelten und sich für die faire Behandlung bedanken.
Als wir weggingen, da standen die Leute, da standen die hinter Hecken oder Büschen und haben uns heimlich gewunken.
Ridding the islands once and for all of Germans was perhaps the simplest problem facing the liberators. Dealing with collaborators and informers was a much trickier task.
Everybody was pointing the finger at everybody else, so the British got fed up and they packed them up. They took 40 main collaborators, took them to dear old England and released them there. England always seems to get the rubbish.
Some of the jerry bags had a terrible hard time, because I witnessed a chase through the streets. There was all this noise going on, and there was a crowd of people pursuing this poor woman who was running for her life, and she fell a number of times.
Some members of the Whitehall were not at all happy about the fact that quite a few children had been born with German parents.
2,100 babies from German and English origin remained when we left the islands.
Babies were not the only mementos the Germans left behind. Nearly 200,000 mines had been laid, and some of the prisoners were kept back to clear them. They were also needed to tackle the hundreds of miles of barbed wire they'd strewn everywhere, and without gloves it seemed. But islanders had other complaints.
There was much resentment over the fact that people who were known to have indulged in the black market and made a massive money out of the black market, were allowed to keep all that German money that they got and have it converted into English money after the war.
The cruiser Jamaica sailed into St. Helier Harbour, Jersey, carrying the King and Queen on their first visit to the Channel Islands since the Germans were thrown out. It was 24 years since the last royal visit, when King George V and Queen Mary visited the island.
After their experience of the previous 5 years, it was hardly surprising that islanders, especially the evacuees, took an early opportunity to end some of their more feudal procedures and introduce a greater element of democracy into their affairs.
At Government House, the King and Queen met the deputies of the State Assembly, Jersey's ancient parliament. The King said, "After your long sufferings, I hope the island will soon regain its former glory." A 15 minutes flight in a silver Dakota of RAF Transport Command carried their majesties on to Guernsey. Candy Gardens, Guernsey's main park, was visited at the end of the tour of the island. 3 little girls representing the islands of Guernsey, Alderney and Sark gave the Queen bouquets tied with ribbons of their island's colours. A loyal address was handed to the King by Mrs. Hathaway, the indomitable Dame of Sark. Said the islanders, "We welcome your majesties within this small but ancient appanage of the Crown of England, so recently freed from the hands of your majesty's enemies."
But the King and Queen didn't visit Alderney and what little remained of the only SS concentration camp on British soil. The Germans had levelled it themselves before leaving. No plaque marks the spot. Clearly, many would prefer the whole embarrassing episode to be forgotten. Certainly, the British made little attempt to bring to justice those responsible for the cruelties perpetrated here. They argued that the crimes were not committed against British subjects, though of course they were committed on British soil. But then the general wish in Whitehall, as well as in the islands, was to put the war years behind them as quickly as possible.
I know a lot of people now that were collaborated very heavily, and as past, people's forgotten it, you know. They accept it now.
The majority of people in Jersey, they were so relieved to be liberated. And such a close-knit society in Jersey. They were afraid for themselves, maybe afraid for their jobs. So they were quite content to let matters lie.
All those laws against people during the occupation were sanctioned when the war ended by the British government. In effect, they were given the OK, which leaves a taste in the mouth.
I was certainly incensed that nothing had been done except popular action against jerry bags and known or suspected informers and so forth, which I rather felt at the time and still feel was probably allowed to happen as dealing with minor scapegoats. Some young women were tarred and feathered, some windows were smashed and things like this. And to me, the real inquiry that should have taken place wasn't that, and it never did take place.
I wrote to the authorities on Jersey. I named the people. There was little response. I then got in touch with the Home Office here, and I gave them the evidence. They took the evidence away. It was written evidence. And I never got it back again. All I received was a threat that if I continued in my accusations, I would probably come to some kind of problem myself.
Like a number of other people, I gave quite a lot of information after liberation to the Civil Affairs Unit that was set up here. Quite a thick dossier, to the best of my knowledge, was drawn up as to degrees of collaboration and so on. And the chap in charge, Captain Kent, if I remember rightly, said to me rather cynically one day when I was asking him what was going to happen to all this, he said it will all be recorded away and forgotten. And I think that's exactly what has happened. I'm told by a journalist who's tried to delve into this in the official records that the 1945 Channel Island file still isn't open to public scrutiny. So somebody has decided that it's better not to tell this tale.